My final presentation and how I incorporated storytelling into my whole class instruction in order to increase engagement. So at the very beginning of the year, I found out very quickly that engaging a whole class of 30 10-year-olds is hard. So I am the main teacher for my 5th grade class, and I found that my instruction when I was giving whole class instruction was not engaging for my 5th grade class. So there's low levels of work output, there's lots of disrupting noises, side conversations when I was speaking, and overall just uninspired discussions that I was not impressed with based on my teaching and how my students were reacting to it. So it wasn't working for me, and it definitely wasn't working for my students. So I wanted to research methods that would engage my class during whole group instruction in order to increase engagement. And I found my method from following research from Zaretta Hammond, the queen of culturally responsive teaching. So I wanted to try using culturally responsive method of storytelling within my instruction. And this is how I was led to my research question: how does utilizing storytelling approaches support the engagement of Latinx students? So I wasn't sure if storytelling was the answer, but I knew from the information that I found in my initial research that it was worth a shot because there's so many benefits to it, and I wanted to try it out. All right, so why storytelling? So storytelling is considered to be a culturally responsive teaching method for Latinx students because it represents and reflects the tradition of telling oral histories that are present in many Latinx cultures. And I wanted to reflect my students' culture in my teaching because I was hoping this would create more engagement and interest in whole group instruction. It also provides an alternative form of learning. So I found that a lot of my students were below grade level and they were overwhelmed by the curriculum being taught to them because it's pretty abstract and not very concrete, because especially in social studies, we're talking about things that happened like 300, 400, or 500 years ago. So storytelling is beneficial because it provides contextualized meaning to abstract concepts. And like I said, it's a culturally responsive teaching method for Latinx students. My class demographic is 80% Latinx, as you can see from this little pie chart that I made. So I wanted to reflect the majority of my students' cultures. So what is storytelling and what does it even look like? So storytelling is very open-ended in how it's incorporated into instruction. It's any spoken piece that has creativity, ongoing evolution, and chronological depth. So it can be someone giving an interview with a story, a song being played that follows the story, poems being read, movies, books being read out loud, authors reading stories, people giving speeches, guest speakers telling stories, discussions with people sharing personal stories. It goes on and on. So what it ended up looking like in my instruction was that I included lots of videos telling people stories. So I know how to choose my battles now, and I wanted to take the burden of planning a story to tell for each lesson off my own shoulders, and instead I took videos and stories from Latinx and Indigenous people and incorporated that into my instruction. So mainly I focused on social studies and a part of ELA, which was our read aloud. So I include videos of how Indigenous people felt about colonization, because that's something we learn in 5th grade, and how the stories that they use to tell that message. And we also started a read aloud where I used YouTube videos of a British guy reading the book that we read, Blood on the River, instead of me reading to the kids, because he had a lot more inflection, and the kids, I was hoping for further engagement into our story. So how did I collect my data? So my data started as one thing and kind of ended up totally different than I had planned, and I will go into what that was. But my driving goal was to collect pre and post inclusion of storytelling into my instruction data so that I could better compare the engagement levels. So my initial data collection was focused on all 30 of my students. So I did a teacher observation journal after each whole class lesson, focusing on what I noticed and how the class was responding. I also was looking at data for whole class driving questions, which I will go into in a second, and all 30 students' student work output. So I found very early on that this was way too much, and I will go into these links in a second. But I found that the scope was way too large, and I wanted to focus on a smaller sample of students for my own well-being, and also to make my data more efficient and specific. So I chose 3 of my high-flying students, so my students that require a lot of attention, and continued to look at the pre and post inclusion of storytelling in my data. So I kept the idea of a teacher observation journal, but only focused on the 3 students, and I'll show that in a second. I also kept the driving questions. So in our Monday morning check-in, I have a Google form that students fill out telling me about their weekend and whatever they want to share. And I included this question at the very end, and I just wanted to focus on the 3 focus students' answers. Finally, I used the focus student work output. I wanted to keep a record of observations from when students were working on the lesson activity that went with the whole class instruction. So I focused the observations on the 3 students and how they were completing the activity and if it was done accurately. So I'll go in now to my data collection. So here is my teacher observation journal. So you can see I did pre-storytelling collection. This was as a whole class, and then after October 20th, I realized it was way too much to take on. So I only started my focus student observations after that. On November 7th, I started incorporating storytelling. So we started a new read aloud, and I started using a lot more videos of people telling their own stories. And I just I observed and wrote down a quick brain dump each day. As for my focus student driving question, I used the question in my Google form, does my instructional method, the way I teach, work for you? And did it work last week? So I also have that in Spanish because I have a lot of bilingual students. So my 3 focus students are highlighted. This is student number 1, student 2 in yellow, and student 3 in red. And I kind of made this little graph that went along with it. So I coded my data to be 1, 2, 3 is based on no, kind of, and yes, and I saw an increase in what students thought was engaging. Finally, I had this document that I just printed out a class list, and I coded my findings and my observations for the work that was being done. So we can look down here. My code was that if students were on task, I gave them a star during that activity time, so a worksheet, completing the questions for a read aloud, whatever it was. A triangle was that they were doing the work accurately. They weren't just filling in with random answers. And an X means they were off task, doing whatever it was that they were not supposed to be doing, or filling in random answers. So based on those 3 data collection methods, I analyzed the data. So with my teacher observation journal, I did a content analysis. I looked over my observations to see if there's any big difference in the behaviors that I recorded for my 3 students. My focus student driving question, so I data coded it. A no was a 1, a kind of was a 2, and a yes was a 3. And then I created that graph that I showed to see trends related to my research question. And then my final focus student work output, I also data coded. Just like how I analyzed the behavior record, I want to see if there was trends in the data, so I coded the data to be able to see that better. So once I did all that, here's what I found after analyzing the focus student data. So my findings, I found that based off my data collection, I could not find any real conclusions. So my driving question, I didn't see a clear trend, but I did see that all 3 students ended their answers. So after I incorporated the storytelling methods into my instruction, they weren't answering a no. So that feels like a good thing. And this, when I looked at the whole class data as well, it follows the same trend. Then with my teacher observation journal for my focus students, when I read it back, I found a notable decrease in unengaged behavior, which the main one that I was looking to stop is talking with neighbors, and a higher rate of participation in whole class through my data. But again, I don't know if it's enough to find a real conclusion. Finally, with my focus student work output observation, I see that it did increase for my focus student as they were a little bit more on task after incorporating the storytelling, but it's not clear enough to make a solid conclusion. So now, what can I conclude from my 3 focus students? Honestly, I don't really know. So after I analyzed my data and the trends that all 3 topics the data follow, I want to say that the increase in productivity, decrease in unengaged behavior, and positive change in the driving question data mean that incorporating storytelling did increase engagement. But I think it's important to point out that my data cycle was short, and in that time there was a lot of outside factors that could contribute to changes in those 3 students. So we had new seats, which I noted, parent-teacher conferences, different units being taught, and because of all these outside influences, I can't make a clear conclusion based on my data. So because of all that, what can I conclude from my process? In doing the study, I found that the behaviors and observation that I was seeing and thinking were unengaged, could have actually been really productive. So when I was reflecting, I was like, maybe that student doing this is them showing engagement. But looking deeper at my data showed me that there's actually a lot of good happening in my classroom that I didn't see before. And I don't know if that's the super high standard I hold myself to or just being a first year teacher. But looking back, I see that there is a lot of good. I also found there are a lot of parts I would have changed if I was going to redo this project, and I am going to work on it later as my culminating project for my master's. But I wish my data cycle had been a little longer and more concentrated on just one unit so that I could start to eliminate some of those outside factors. I wish I also kept more detailed notes, but in a more efficient manner, because I was super overwhelmed by the data collection process. But I would also love to try different methods that show more insight. And that is everything I concluded from my data analysis project. I went super fast, but overall, I want to say that there was an increase in engagement. And if I look forward to looking into this more during my field study class.